So a couple of welcome notes. First, happy Pride Month. More on that to come. We are excited to have Nisha Dua and Robin Lee here as our panelists today. We have links to their bio in the Zoom chat. And you can log in, you can see their bios in the booklet for those who are here in person who don't want to log in. Speaking of the Zoom chat again, tell us who you are, include your LinkedIn. We'd love to have folks connect, and we know that folks do actually connect by that. If you have questions for the panelists, drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them during the discussion today. And you can also see the great startups in our 2023 VentureCrushFG cohort on an Airtable that we've also dropped in the chat. All right, so on July 12th, we have our upcoming VentureCrushFG with Charles Hudson, who's chair of the National Venture Capital Association and is also the founder of Precursor Ventures and a lecturer at Stanford. I want to thank our great Lowenstein Sandler Venture Crush team, Ariel, Brittany, Ingela, Ginny, Jenny, Karen, Owen, and Carrie Fisk, and our Lowenstein Sandler colleagues, Latoya Bethune, Chris Cousins, Nigel Pura Bryant, who helped with some research for today. There is a Venture Crush Africa Global event in person next week. We've teamed up with Africa Tech New York. So that's Thursday, June 29th, 5 o'clock, right here in this room. And we're going to have two panels on venture investing in Africa Tech. So before we begin, I mentioned Pride Month. Today's topic centers on VC funding and recruiting and building culture. Before, or rather as part of that discussion, I'd like to acknowledge not just Pride Month, but next week marks the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which were a response to police raids. They began in the early morning of June 28, 1969. So here are a few facts that we learned from our partnership with LGBT Plus VC, which is the first 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to advancing the LGBTQIA plus and ally venture capital community. Number one, it's currently estimated that less than 1% of venture dollars go to openly LGBTQIA plus founders. Depressing fact number two, since the start of this year, and we're not even halfway through it, there have been more than 500 anti-LGBTQIA plus bills introduced in state legislatures across the country. Given the number of states we have, that sounds like more than 10 per state, although some states are bagging way more than their limit. And as Dominic Midori Davis, who's great and you should follow, reported in TechCrunch, there are founders that still feel the need to hide their identity from their investors, hoping that the investors in this room and elsewhere make an effort to help fix that. So as we acknowledge these facts and talk about the culture that we're building both in our own companies as well as in the broader community, there are a couple of questions we'd love for you to consider during and after today's event. As a venture investor, what percentage of your investments go toward traditionally underrepresented founders who face discrimination in our society? I know that's something our panelists care about. As an exec, board member, or educator, what's your current strategy on recruitment? What percentage of your talent, including your C-suite, make up underrepresented employees who face discrimination in our society? And finally, as a venture capital community, in what ways are we all working toward a more inclusive culture in our ecosystem? Those are also things that can be discussed in the breakout rooms should you choose. So thank you all for joining today's event. We look forward to getting started, and we're going to have the panelists introduce themselves a little bit. And I'm going to start with a question for Nisha, and welcome. Thank you for being here. Your website bio starts with your career path wasn't entirely linear, but Nisha has always ended up where she was meant to be. Explain.
Well, I think let's see if this is loud enough. Can you guys hear me?
I just wanted to hear it.
Yeah, he's got a bit of an echo, right?
Yeah.
A little echoey.
Maybe correct that. Well, I'll yell in the meantime. I'm loud in this Australian. I mean, I think they say about most career paths is you can only connect the dots in retrospect. But I find it's useful to lead with that because I think there are a lot of folks today in venture, particularly younger associates, who you probably meet them as well, Robin, come and say, like, how did you get into venture? And certainly the truth is I was never aspiring to get into venture. I started my career as a lawyer in mergers and acquisitions law. I was deeply bored. I'm so sorry, Ed. In fact, I was downright depressed, much more interested in business dynamics and found my way into management consulting at Bain. Had always wanted to be an operator, so ended up running strategy and operations for a 1,300 person group at AOL covering 40 different brand websites. I ran one of our websites. I launched a startup within AOL, a consumer software startup using an algorithm to match young folks with professionals. And from there, we actually launched VBG Ventures, and I can tell you about the thesis for the fund. But what I would say about that is the dots come together because all those experiences ended up being highly relevant for being in VC, whether it's doing the deals, negotiation, doing the diligence and getting smart and becoming an expert on an arena very quickly, to at least having some operational experience that could be considered helpful, or having the empathy that an early stage founder has seen, and the trials and tribulations that you go through kind of starting a new brand and building an audience. So it has very much been I think, a sum of pieces that has ended up being larger in value than they all maybe felt at the time, even the legal part. So that's why I start the bio with that sentence.
Well, it does take the sting out of your assault on the entire legal and particularly M&A profession that you found consulting to be exciting. So, you know, that's good context. Can you tell us a little bit about BBG?
Yeah. So we're probably best known as one of the first funds to put a stake in the ground around backing female-led companies. We did this in 2014 when it was still novel, and I think the world was finally starting to recognize that women were this dominant consumer force. It's sort of hilarious to say that today, 8 or 9 years later, because I think that's a well-trod story and thesis. I think what was true then and is still true today is that when you talk about mandates, and it's appropriate that we're talking about this during Pride Month, and just after AAPI month, is when you talk about mandates, you are very often reduced to mission, equity, initiative, program, etc. But what we believe is there's extraordinary value and alpha to be unlocked by finding founders who uniquely understand new audiences and have some unique insight into building for those audiences. So our thesis has actually evolved a little because the world has changed. So in 2014, yes, it's true that the world was coming out of this sort of pro forma consumer, white man as the dominant sort of profile for clinical research, to test crash dummies. Women emerged as a consumer monolith, and the truth is no consumer group is a monolith. And the way we describe our thesis today is we're actually investing in female or diverse founders who are building for the polycultural future of America. And that's really driven by 3 trends. The first is the emerging and changing racial profile of the country. Gen Alpha is going to be the first majority-minority generation in the country. We're about to embark upon, I think, a historic generational turnover of power. And the data from the latest census also shows that. The second is, I think, a continued widening in the wealth gap across both, not just racial lines, but also worker lines. So the gaps between knowledge workers and deskless workers continue to grow. And then thirdly, an aging population. Also data coming from the 2022 census. The median age in America is now 38, that's up from 30. Boomers and the grayer generation above that, it's got to come up with a better name than the silent generation. Living longer, working longer, that's changing the dynamic, and we have an increasingly intergenerational consumer. So we're really looking at where are the big opportunities for technology to rethink every big category of the economy to better serve these consumers. But that means both B2B and B2C, because sometimes a solution to meet these folks where they are will be better delivered by a B2B model. So we're early stage, pre-seed and seed. We like to lead and co-lead institutional rounds. And I would say we're thesis-driven generalists.
And how long have you and your co-founder been working together in one capacity or another?
It's my longest relationship yet. And I am married and I'm having a baby with someone, which is, that's kind of saying something. But Susan and I actually met in 2013 and I was her first hire at AOL. So we've gone from being employee and boss to equal partners, I mean, kind of in the space of a year and a half. We started working together and launching the fund. But it has been a very long and fruitful relationship. And she's not only my longest relationship, but also my best friend and my biggest debater, which is what you want in a partnership.
That's great. And she is also a legend.
She is a legend. Her reputation precedes her.
We can talk more about that a little later as well. So Robin, in advance of today, I was looking back at, I don't know, do you have more than 3 degrees? I know you have like several advanced degrees, but you're also in Richard Kirby's data set. And for those who don't know this, Richard Kirby wrote this terrific article. He's the co-founder of Equal Ventures, and he wrote this great article called Where Did You Go to School? And in the article, he talked about the lack of academic background diversity in venture, among other types of diversity lacking in venture. And 2 of your degrees are atypical in that data set because he didn't just footnote a data set, he actually provided it publicly. You have you have a degree from Rutgers, a master's from Hunter, and a master's from U Chicago. And your Hunter, in his data set of 1,500 VCs, many of whom have 3-4 degrees, Hunter comes up 3 times.
Oh.
Once for you and twice as a first name. Similarly, Rutgers comes up 3 times, once for you, and then there are 2 other VCs on the West Coast who are Rutgers alums.
I know one of them.
Okay. And this is 2018. You've been in venture for years. You've been on the boards of many companies and have made numerous investments. How do you think your academic background, especially in public universities, which are underrepresented in that data set as a whole, is an advantage in your venture day job?
First, I think I wasn't sure it would be or not when I first started in venture. I think I was like, when I first started in venture in 2013, it was my first time in Silicon Valley and in California overall. And so it was, obviously I was not plugged in, right? An outsider. It was very much led by Stanford, Berkeley, Harvard alumni. And I think the one thing that actually helped was not being in those networks, because I felt like, one, it made me work harder to get to know more people. And so I think, at most conferences, most events, everything, like I just made an effort to kind of like meet other VCs and other founders, whereas many already are in those circles to begin with. And so I think that was really helpful. But like 2, I think it was just like a very different perspective overall. Like when, Rutgers is obviously very huge, 40,000 plus undergrad, and then Hunter here in the city. I think I was very much in kind of like growing up the kind of lower income to like middle class versus like a lot of my peers in venture. And so because of that, I got like as a consumer investor, which was what I started out to be, it was a very big advantage because we were looking at companies in the e-commerce space, for example, or social networking space that actually targeted the mass market, and like, which was why we didn't do a lot of the companies like Fab or Guild or the ones who targeted very high end, and actually led our investments into like Xiaohongshu or like Poshmark and Wish, etc. And so I think it was in that regard, it was like really helpful. And now we've been doing a lot of programs on the recruiting side for our portfolio companies and for GGV through a lot of the like non-traditional venture schools.
That's great. And you also have started fairly recently your own network alongside your colleague Hans Tung. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, I think coming out of COVID and especially on the Stop Asian Hate kind of movement, and we felt like there wasn't a lot of representation in venture, whether it was like in the VC side or founder side, or even independent board members of like the AAPI community. And so Hans, who is our managing partner and who I work very closely with for the last 10 years, know him pre-GGV. He was my boss at Qiming Venture Partners, but we decided to put together an AAPI community. And so we kind of kicked it off in February of this year following Lunar New Year. And now it's a little bit over 1,000 today of AAPI founders and investors, and a Slack group and a Google Sheet directory so that people could support one another and partner with one another.
And if there are people in the room or on Zoom, and by the way, for Zoom, there might be a visual issue. So if we're showing people the slide deck rather than the panel, maybe we can flip that. But how do people join if they want to join? Are they allowed to join?
Yeah, you can find the information on my LinkedIn, and it's a type form. And so you just fill out the type form, and then I will send you a personal email to invite you into the community.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about GGV and what GGV is doing today, which is a little different than what GGV was doing a few years back?
Yeah. So GGV is a global VC firm that started in 2000 with roots in Singapore and Silicon Valley. And so today we have offices in 2 offices in Silicon Valley, Menlo Park in San Francisco. I'm here in New York. We have a Singapore office and a Beijing and Shanghai office as well. And so we invest across all stages. So we're very much vertical specific, but stage agnostic. And when I started at GGV, we were at Fund 5, which was like a $550 million fund. And today we're investing at a Fund 8, which is a $2.5 billion fund. And so even that has shifted quite a bit in terms of what we invest in. Like when I first started, it was very much more growth. Now we do everything from C to pre-IPO, though I would say like majority of our checks tends to be in like A, Bs, and Cs, 10 to 40 million initially into a company. And like sectors too, I've done a lot in consumer internet, and like in the last few years have spent a lot of time and investments in fintech. And so that's one shift that we had. Another shift is that like we've done a lot more in enterprise infrastructure and DevOps. And so we actually now have a huge presence in Israel, not an office yet, but we actually have 15 portfolio companies there, which was non-existent maybe like just 4 or 5 years ago. And so we've been spending a lot of time there. And another vertical that we spend a lot of time in is SMB, tech, and vertical SaaS.
Okay. And one of the questions from the founders, so we had, before this, we had a founder-only session for the companies that are in the current VentureCrushFG program. And one of the questions that was made in a stage whisper to me was, is anyone investing in consumer internet and particularly commerce and consumer internet right now. And so what percentage of that $2.5 billion current fund do you think gets deployed over the next 12 to 18 months into those kinds of consumer web commerce companies, since you have historically done an annual commerce conference, often doing it in this very room? So where are we? Quiet period?
So
You
I
can also
thought,
plead the fifth.
no. So I thought we were in a quiet period because I was like, oh my God, I haven't done an e-commerce deal in years. And I was like, there was, we've traditionally done we've done a lot of marketplaces. The last marketplace we did was maybe 2 years ago, which was, or a year and a half ago, Swimply. And then the one before that was StockX. And so like, in terms of marketplaces, we haven't done it a lot. And then I would say, finally, I did one again. And I was so happy. And so we just did a Series B in Quince. I don't know if you know that company, but they are I would say like a premium Shein. So direct from manufacturer to the consumer. I was actually taken aback because it was the best metrics in e-commerce I've ever seen, like in the last decade.
So that's what you need to get funded in e-commerce right now, the best metrics of the decade.
Well, I mean, like from a business model innovation standpoint, like I think like because of that and because of the efficiency and the like PMF, like it was just a no-brainer.
PMF is
product market fit. Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. It's good. So a lot of VCs tout their superpowers. Nisha, black belt?
I mean, I don't know if that's a superpower that I'm using with my founders, but I mean, I think mental discipline is helpful in being a VC.
Do you have a black belt?
I do, yeah.
In what?
In Zenbukan Kempo Karate, and I used to cross train.
And have you ever, killed someone with just your bare hands?
I have not, because the superior martial artist avoids conflict.
I have no response. Okay, with that, let's go to the questions posed out loud by the founders in our session before this. And we're talking about community, we're talking about recruiting, the opposite of recruiting, employment stuff, and culture. So in terms of, there were a number of impact companies in our cohort, unsurprisingly. I think, Nisha, you consider yourselves to be an impact fund. GGV doesn't.
Yeah, we don't, but 70% of our companies end up having an impact focus, largely because of where we're investing. So health, future of work, finance, climate, and areas or solutions to overlook.
And the other 30% you invested like vaping companies or
no,
something else
actually
atrocious?
Our mandate has evolved to say, like when we think about what we want to invest in at BBG, we want to invest in founders who are moving the world forward. So even in that 25%, we would still feel that there could be companies in conflict with our values, and a vaping company would be. So an example of one that is not necessarily an impact company, but might be, we actually do have a couple of commerce companies in this recent portfolio, but Starface, which is a very fast growing D2C, and actually I shouldn't say D2C, but consumer goods company. They're building a new platform for Gen Z to reject the concept of perfection in beauty. And we think that moves that generation forward. They've also launched another company called Blip, which is the anti-vaping company, which is to help Gen Z stop smoking. So those would be examples of companies that fit into our 30 or 20, 30%.
So how do those companies balance impact, which people who run impact funds or run impact companies often feel they need to distance themselves from in order to get funding, in order to be taken seriously by investors? How do you strike that balance when you are talking to investors like you or Robin?
TAM and business model, which
Okay.
I think are the same.
And what's TAM?
Total addressable market. And not just TAM, but SAM, share of addressable market, which I think is the important asterisk anytime you talk about addressable markets. But I think it should really be the same things that are differentiating any startup pitching. So whether you're an impact startup or you're a regular startup, it is team, addressable market, and business model. And those three things will always trump anything. And I would encourage any startup in the impact space to be leading with those three things, whether or not you're an impact startup or not.
Robin, do you find that people who like have impact in their deck when they are showing their fund to Nisha are taking that slide out when they're showing it to you?
I mean, I think for us, definitely, like, those are very important, but like what we would like to see on impact specifically is actually like how much cost of capital does this require in the long term? Because sometimes impact companies could either be in like clean energy or clean tech or climate tech, which takes a lot to build or a lot of investments. And then also like our biggest question tends to be go to market and how long that adoption cycle is, which ends up deterring a lot of why we don't invest in climate or in impact.
Maybe we could draw this out further. So those 70% of our companies are impact focused. I don't see a lot of impact slides in the deck. So I think there are different ways to look at this. In climate, maybe yes, more obviously, there is a clear impact story. But you know, if you look at some of the healthcare companies we're investing in, like take maternal healthcare, for instance, America has extraordinarily poor maternal healthcare outcomes generally, and especially for women of color. But if I have a founder who's coming in and pitching me on what is the model to solve that problem, they're talking about a problem and a solution. They're not talking about being an impact company. And I think the same has now emerged for climate tech companies too. And I think Robin's point is well taken, which is we're venture investors. So we care about timeline to outcome. And so we are less likely to be investing where there is high CapEx or a long time frame. You know, we think, for example, in the arena of climate, that we're better served investing in software companies or digitally enabled companies versus frontier tech, and different VCs take a different view on that. But I agree, I think it comes down to the business fundamentals.
And let's talk a little bit about hiring. One comment that we got that seemed to be seconded and thirded around the room was, when I talk to directors of engineering, they say that your first hire needs to be an engineer. When I talk to directors of sales, they say that first hire should be in sales. What do investors like to see on the use of funds slide, and what actually works?
Can you clarify which stage this is? This is like the very first round.
Yeah.
And that question is posed from VCs who've been in sales?
Founder, this is from the founder perspective, where they're starting to use their pre-seed funding or their seed funding to build out a team that goes beyond the founders.
I mean, it depends on the company entirely. So what is the competitive advantage of your company, and what is the team required to, I mean, if you're building an AI company, probably it's in engineering. You would hope that there's some skill set there. But maybe you've actually done pre-seed where you have those hires already. And now you're, depending on the business model, maybe you have an enterprise model and you need to be thinking about sales. But I think most VCs would argue that the founder is classically doing sales at that early stage for some time. And you're probably waiting to bring on a head of sales till your Series A. If you're in a really competitive consumer goods category, maybe actually you more immediately need a marketing hire. But even that at the seed stage is tricky. I think the founder is still running some of those core functions because you're still on that product market fit curve. So I think you really have to think about what is the story I'm selling as it relates to why are we the right team to win in this market. So if you go back to fundamental questions that a VC is thinking about, why now, why this product, why this team, how does the team you're pulling together really support that narrative, and what is so relevant in your company space?
I can actually give like a very specific example of like 2 pre-seed companies that I've invested in, and we almost like never do pre-seed. And so, but like it was really one of them was because both of them were like because of the team. And so when we do pre-seed, it's typically like founders we've known either for a long time or they were already founders in our portfolio who are doing it the second or third time around. And so one case where we kind of did the pre-seed and they actually just got a seed term sheet. So of the first, and I think 2 more are coming in this week. And so if you are fundraising, like there is hope, and they're not in the AI space. But like what they had in the founding team and where we had a bit of concern actually was like they had nobody who was technical on the team, on the founding team. And so when we invested, it was really because of the 3 founders. 2 of them were full-time. One of them was never was not a founder before, but he was the second employee of a startup before. So he was pretty much like there from the beginning and saw the growth, but he headed sales there. And so he actually brought in grew from 0 to 200 million of revenue on the sales side of that, his previous company. And so for him starting this company, which was selling actually SaaS to airports, airlines, and stadiums, like they actually didn't have a technical product yet. And so we invested in them with the idea of what they were building. And his co-founder was in ops. And so while he did product, and while he did oversee an engineering team, they were actually more of like part-time at first. And then actually to raise this current round, they actually spent whatever money they had left to hire in a VP of Eng. And so they kind of got a couple of sales done with like MVP or like an early stage product, and then went out to hire right before raising their round. And so like this CTO or VP of Eng will now be coming in to be one of the founding team members at their seed round. So I thought that was interesting.
I was just going to say, I think what becomes really compelling as well is getting to the next level of specificity. So when you see a deck or you have a conversation and the conversation is about use of funds, you seeing the pie chart that is X% to marketing, X% to team is not compelling, right? It gets better when you can say, okay, these are the core roles in the team. Mm-hmm. But what is really most important is saying, these are the next 3 hires I need to make, and they're people like this, and I'm already in conversations with those people. So do you understand where you want to poach from, and are you already networking into those people? That's when you start uncovering the layers of the onion that, oh, this founder really understands the type of person they need to win. And maybe the opposite of example of this is we had a pre-seed company. We like the founders a lot. We thought they needed a really strong engineer on the team, but it was not clear to us that they understood what type of engineer they needed. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, because they were talking about, an outsourced agency, and they could not really pinpoint where they would go to find this person once they moved on from the agency. So really spending time, talk to a ton of people in that expertise to really figure out who has the right profile, not just a title on LinkedIn that you're looking for.
And that's an interesting segue to one of the other questions that we received, which was, how do you balance the kind of desperate need to fill the hole with cultural fit? And, you both referenced like this person was missing, or they hired this person just before the round. And maybe in so doing, they actually de-risked the company enough to make the round something compelling. And maybe without that hire, the round would have been less compelling. And the investors who invested at that time might not have known that the new hire was not a cultural fit. So how do you balance, like, yes, we're building out the team, but this person might not be someone great for the culture of the company?
I think sometimes it's hard to tell without actually trying, right? Like, you can interview all you want, but most of what we've seen work really well for early stage companies, even I guess even for later stage companies, is like having the hire be a consultant first, and then for like 3 months, and then transition into a full-time hire. And I do think because of the markets today, like on the talent side, this is much easier to do than before. And we actually also see this on the board side. And so for most independent board roles, we've always seen the candidate have spent time either as an advisor and grew up with the company and then transition into independent board role, or they spent time with the company for like 1 or 2 quarters and then transition into an independent board role too.
I mean, I would second that. I think that's where we've seen some of the biggest success in hires actually being embedded well in the company, either advisor or contractor. The other thing I would say is, I think what is really helpful to founders and startup culture is this concept of hire fast, fire fast. So yes, it is true, we need to be nimble with our hiring, but we need to make very hard decisions when someone is not a culture fit. But I think the mistake people make in the hire fast piece is not being well set up to make good hires from the outset. So even as an early stage founder, you can build developed processes for hiring, and you can build culture early into your company. I think there's a concept, right, which is great discipline creates great freedom. And it is okay to come up with your own process that enables you to meet many, many, many candidates, have some degree of a structured process so you feel confident in those early hires. And as Robin said, they still may not fit, right? They may have sold you a kind of a bump story on their experience, but I think taking the time to actually assess whether they're a culture fit is important too. And so many startups actually don't set culture early. I'm not proposing that you have to do a very long-winded exercise of culture setting, but when you start a company, you have a vision and a mission. You as founders have personalities and values. Have you taken the time to write out what those values are? Do you understand the way in which you work as co-founders or as an early stage team? Do you understand the way in which you give feedback? What are the things that are important to you? And I really encourage you actually to interview for those things, even at the early stage, because there's a temptation when you do your pre-seed and you hear this feedback, oh, you must have this third leg of the stool, so you want to rush out and you fill it. And I have a young founder at the moment who's gone through this in cycles, right? They get very excited about the first person they meet because that person always knows more than you know about that thing. That's why you're hiring for it. It's a very tempting trap to fall into. And so making sure you're meeting enough people, you have some degree of a process. And if you don't know how to run a process, find an advisor who is very skilled in that arena to help you understand what should you be looking for so you can actually assess 5, 10 candidates rather than just that one candidate who seems so sparkly.
And there's a really good question in the chat. I'm straining my eyes a little bit from Sandy Yu. What's your perspective on fractional executives to give the team time and help hire the long-term person? And we see that often in the finance function. But you're talking about, having someone consult for 3 months or whatever. How do you feel about fractional execs?
I think it can be really beneficial where they're not yet a core leg of the stool. Like we see this a lot in fractional CMOs, for example. Often a company does not need a full-time CMO, but that person can be really helpful in guiding the founder for who should be the first couple of junior hires, and then give those junior hires the guidance they need, but the founder doesn't have that expertise. It can be useful in engineering, where engineering is a part of the core of the product or where you're trying to find product market fit. I see it way less valuable in product leaders. I've seen that outsourced a lot and seen it not work a lot, but that's a particular bias I have.
You mentioned fractional CMO, which is interesting because with fractional CFO, you're probably not that worried about competitive issues. But if someone is a CMO and they have expertise in your particular vertical and they're working for you and 3 other companies at the same time, and they'll add, they'll skip to 3 more in the next year, should you be concerned about the competitive issues?
The competition, I mean, it depends what type of company you're talking about. Maybe you've got an opinion running a season so much time in commerce. But if I think about what's happening, trying to find customers on social media today, for example, I mean, it's a pretty even stakes game. What it really comes down to is how differentiated is the product. Like anyone can go into a company and roll out classic strategies across social and search, and sure, maybe some new channels like Reddit or Discord, but I don't think there's like some deep secret sauce that CMOs can be giving away right now. I think what really matters is, have you found product market fit, and have you found the message that relates to the customer you're trying to acquire? So we've not really seen that as a huge concern.
I also think that given the state of like a lot of transitions where a lot of companies either had a reduction in force, like sometimes a fractional piece comes in handy.
Let's talk about reductions in force since you mentioned it, and I really don't want to bring it up on my own. There have been a whole bunch of RIFs in venture-backed companies. So I have been working with startups and venture-backed startups since the 90s. I have never seen a move this swift from, holy cow, we cannot hire fast enough and we need to hire lots and lots of people, and being in boardrooms where all of these companies were behind plan just on hiring, to, whoa, we're not hiring right now and let's start discussing a RIF. And is this RIF deep enough? And how do we ensure that this is the only one we do? And whoops, it's not going to be the only one we do. How are you seeing that impact culture? And are there things you're seeing folks do to ensure that culture is persevering?
I just had this conversation with a founder yesterday. I mean, we have to start with sort of like, what was the environment? The environment was grow fast at all costs. And so people were raising too much money and didn't know where to allocate that money. And so I think founders to some degree and investors have to accept their own role in that. And so what that means is, as a founder, you really have to own your part in the decision to make change. So we talked with this founder yesterday who said that this has been the hardest part of my company today, this period last year where we had to let go of this many people. It's also been my most proud moment today, because we have come through it, and while it was hard, everyone who's left is on the same page. And she did that, I think, through being very direct and honest with the entire team about why these hard decisions had to be made. And she was clear with them that it was going to feel uncomfortable, that they were going to lose colleagues that they very much liked, but there were certain realities of the market. And I think what she did that was very helpful was be very clear about where the strategy of the company was going and where the focus of the company was going. So she took them on the journey with her. Now, you can't reveal everything always to all your employees, but you have to give them a guiding light. right? Like, where is the company's focus going? So how does that relate to why we're leaning out? And you can also be honest about the general market sentiment. I mean, I think the honest truth is that doesn't mean it was a perfect transition. They still had to deal with a number of very unhappy employees who were left, who lost friends and colleagues, but supporting them through that with continued open transparency, I think is really valuable. And I think for her, the honest truth is some of those people who left were people who maybe did not have the right attitude for the company at that time, and so the remaining team has become stronger. That's not always the case, but I think they have ended up as a stronger company because of it, and now all those employees see that.
I think that is like some of the silver lining is some of the companies that raised, well, many of the companies that raised in 2021 with that amount of money in that short period of time had to hire so much. And quite frankly, like, I think there weren't a lot of structure in place to like evaluate performance or even kind of manage the employees that were there. And so some of our portfolio, like some of the employees were actually relieved sometimes because they were like, oh, there were a lot of people on our team that weren't actually performing. And like, we didn't know what to do. And like the RIF actually kind of enabled the companies to like have better KPIs or actually like even create them, because I think a lot of companies, didn't do that from the onset.
And it also goes back to this original conversation of value and cultures. Like, what is the sort of company you want to build? I mean, there's a big question around, should every startup be taking venture funding? Venture funding comes with a series of milestones and growth push, and you have to be really honest with yourself about, is that the kind of company I want to grow? Or actually, do I want to grow a little bit more slowly? And would that change my hiring plans? And I think not all founders were ready for that. They were not ready for that sort of show to stop, and they sort of didn't realize what they'd gotten themselves into. So I think thinking about that from the outset in terms of like, what sort of founder do you want to be can be really critical. And if you're willing to go on that journey, then you also have to take the responsibility to say, that was the path I put the company on, and now the rules of the game have changed, and here's how we're going to keep you abreast of how it continues to change.
Actually, one of the companies that did a RIF, like maybe earlier this year, what they did was a lot of the options went back into the pool from the RIF, and so they actually, for those who stayed and were high performers, they actually gave them a little bit more, just to kind of like keep the best talent too.
Yeah.
Because even after a RIF, there are people who are regrettable that actually leave as well, because either their manager was gone or they felt like the team's not going to get support anymore. So we're actually dealing with that right now, where the CMO was let go, and then now the rest of her team is falling apart. But it's actually also a time for transition. So
two threads there that I want to pick up on. One is options and how to use them in this market, because we've been using them very, very differently in the prior market. So I'm going to start with that one, and then I'll try to segue back to the other. Option repricing. People who received options in 2019, in 2021, in 2022 are now realizing that their exercise price on those options just doesn't make sense considering prevailing valuations, right? They're underwater. So we are seeing a lot of option repricing. Option repricing has some real complexities to it, especially if people used incentive stock options, ISOs. What are you seeing as sort of best thoughts around, best practices around option repricing? And I realize that while there are a lot of companies now doing a second or even third option repricing, some companies got past it last year and don't feel the need to redo. But what are you folks seeing in terms of option repricing and the conversations around that?
I mean, our most recent fund is so early stage that we haven't come across the issue yet.
In your most recent fund, what about an older fund?
I will say that I don't feel qualified to comment on those companies because we're not on the boards of a lot of those companies because we were participants. So I think it would be wrong for me to comment from an arm's length. I mean, I'm going to keep it to myself, I think.
You're stuck, Robin. You've got a $2.5 billion fund.
It has happened to all of our portfolio pretty much, more than once. So I guess many of them have, like, I mean, they actually have to like disclose to their employees, right? And so it actually has been sometimes like positive because it actually helps hire like attract new talent into the company because then the options are like now at a very reasonable price and they're like, oh, okay, so you're like, it's not going to take you 3 more years to grow into that valuation that you raised at. And so I think that actually is very helpful and people actually could see the upside. Whereas before employees were like, oh, like we have no revenue or value it at like almost $1 billion, right? Like, and so I think it's healthier all around.
Yeah, and if folks have questions, I don't want them yet, but think of your option repricing questions because I know a number of you do actually have them. You can put them in the chat or we'll try to get to them later. But from where I sit, we saw people breaking the seal last year, and it was accompanied by a lot of timidity and self-doubt because they were the early batch to reprice. But now, even if you're performing, the multiples on revenue, the multiples on whatever are so different that everyone does understand that option repricing has been a really common thing. So doing it is a real retention tool. And there is a big difference between being at a company that has repriced and therefore the go forward team has a different set of incentives than those who left 2 years ago, and being at a company where there are 100x employees who still have options at a variety of prices that no longer make sense, and so do you while you're sitting there. So it can actually be a pretty valuable. I don't think that there's a stigma to it at this point, but there are some technical complexities, and you do, especially with ISOs, have to make disclosure and give people a choice where you trip over some pernicious tax rules. So just something that's important to note. But we're talking about retention and hires. For larger companies, a lot of them anticipate attrition. And they anticipate attrition because we just exited this market where people switch jobs and where people were getting pounded by recruiters constantly to switch jobs. And whatever level of attrition you anticipated based on your 2022, 2021 experience, you were overly optimistic about the level of attrition that you might see in 2023. And that means that with employees sticking around longer than you expected, they may be great, but they may also, themselves need a change, or the company is moving in a slightly different direction or a downsized direction given the market. What are you seeing in terms of people dealing with that? Or is the concept of missing projected attrition not something that folks are really discussing in your boardrooms and management teams?
I don't think we've got any. I think these issues are for bigger tech companies so far. I think we're still seeing some movement. Like, I think people are still thinking about culture and their own place and their own perception of the success of a company. So we're not seeing anyone really miss attrition goals. I mean, we have some fairly big companies in our earlier funds, but I don't think that's a big concern for them yet. I think our early stage companies still thinking about how to hire more people quickly.
Do you have a whole bunch of early stage companies that are in hire mode right now?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think Ed gave us some ground rules to be a bit more optimistic today. But I will say, I mean, it is pleasantly, as Robin said, people are raising, people are looking for great talent. And I think given some of the trends we're seeing out of larger companies, there is talent to be had. So I think if you're an early stage company, it is an exciting time to be hiring, because I think expectations and competition have changed pretty dramatically over the last 12 months as well.
And my comment about being a little more optimistic, I think was, I'm not sure which of you made the comment, but I think it was more of like, be more optimistic than that specific comment.
Yes.
Yeah, and now I remember who made that specific comment.
Which
Speaking
I have
of
not
which,
made.
yeah.
Again.
But are you seeing people talk about, gosh, what with these attrition rates are thinking about recruiting and retention has to change a little?
I think like whenever we talk about attrition in the boardroom, it's always been like regrettable. Like we always measure it against that.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the CFOs have been so strict this year that like if you're not hitting your attrition goal, you don't have a chance to miss it. So people are transitioning people all the time based on, I feel like more than ever, like companies are managing founders are managing their companies to the month, like, because they're very concerned about like just runway and efficiency. I think the metrics have changed so much in terms of what VCs care about, at least on the later stage, has been like, what is your burn ratio? And like, what, how close are you to like break even, right? And like, what does it take to flip that? And so because of all these conversations, I feel like on the attrition front,
which is the venture playbook from 2007, 2012, 2003, 1998, like that. Those were the questions we used to hear. And every now and then it undulates. So that does make sense. Let's talk a little bit. You talked about, venture expectations and what are the questions. How do you, since we're talking about culture, how do you as investors perceive remote or hybrid companies versus in-person companies? Does that adversely impact how financeable you are? And I don't know, hopefully those of you on Zoom just saw the various faces that Nisha made. Remarkably expressive. We're going to play poker for a lot of money after this.
I would say, I don't think it's the particular working model of a company is not a reason we would invest or not invest. We have seen companies, one of our most successful companies is entirely remote, and they have made that work. I have a particular preference for more in-person work because I've seen how newer employees lose out on being embedded into culture, lose out on learning, lose out on camaraderie, but it's not my place to put that on another founder. I think what we're trying to judge is, do we think that this founder has what it takes to execute on what this company needs? And so we're happy to hear, we always ask about the founder's perspective. We're about to close a new investment, and one of those founders is actually based overseas, and they're going to go into, one's on the West Coast, one's in Europe, and they're about to go into a pretty heavy selling phase, right? So we care about that. We ask, can you effectively do that from overseas? So we want to hear that you have a plan and you put considerable thought into how that works. But again, these are for like 3, 4, 5, up to 10-person teams, right? They're not hundreds of people. And I think it's not surprising to see larger tech companies asking people to come back to the office, because there has been a ton of lost productivity and lost connectivity in those companies. And I think it's particularly hard for junior employees. So what you want to know is that the leaders have thought about it and understand how problems are showing up in their own organizations and have a plan to tackle it in the next 18 months.
We've actually been like starting to feel concerned for a lot of our companies who where the leadership team is actually all spread out. And so we're starting to see like signs of breakage in like the culture and just like the productivity on hitting a lot of like what they said that they're going to do. And there's just one company where the founders in Florida, like the two founders are not even in the same state, and like the rest of the management team is dispersed, which means everybody under them is also right spread out. And so like we're trying to solve this issue now, because now the founders like constantly trying to bring everybody back into one room and even change the culture completely. Like before they had like Fridays half off, and like that's not going to happen anymore, right? And yeah, I think like I've heard a lot of board conversations where people were just like not happy with remote or hybrid.
Isn't your leadership team kind of spread out?
Yeah, but I think in venture is so different because like my team is like 2 people. So it's like
So what are some best practices? And there was another question that we got about how you deal with a team that is remote, and how you blend in different cultures in a multicultural remote team to ensure that the team is aligned. So what are some best practices that you've seen with geographically dispersed teams and multicultural teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of like a company that I mentioned earlier, who I think has done a good job of it, I think they paid particular attention to spending money to bring the team together on a regular basis. And I think similarly, if you go back to, okay, who are the people we're hiring? What is our culture? What are our values? They've been very thoughtful about consistency across those from early hires. So I think they have a group of sort of like-minded people who all understand what they're there to build, and then they bring them together regularly. I would say like we're a hybrid team as a venture firm, but we're all based in New York, but we work remotely half the week and in office half the week. And we instituted that because we felt there was a lack of connectivity, and we felt that you lose so much in translation over Slack. And so what we've seen is like where you have a bias towards Slack or doing things by email, and I know people hate meetings, right? There's this like, we've got too many meetings on one hand. So much is getting lost in translation, and that leads to a lot of lost productivity and a lot of misunderstanding on what roles are, how to get something done. And so we really encourage people to pick up the phone more and to say it's an expectation that we are in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but we're all adults and we understand that life happens and you should be able to be flexible within that.
And are you seeing in your best companies, how do you externalize that culture, right? Because you talked about, the importance of having alignment within the company. How do you send that message out into the world that this is the culture of our company? Or is that even important? I mean, it seems like it would be very important so that your customers understand, your potential recruits understand, your partners, your funders understand that this is who you are as a company. What are things that you're seeing people do to just reinforce the definition of what the company's culture is, both internally and out into the world?
But I think for an early stage company, it's a little bit, the importance is for your existing employees and for the people you're trying to hire. It depends on how much of a consumer-facing brand you have. I always think actually Warby Parker did a great job of explaining their values and why they started and their mission. And they were really smart because they tied it into brand strategy, but people knew why they were there. And so I think employees that were hiring knew why they were there. But for a classic early stage company, I think the mistake that people make is they don't have conversations about it as a founding team. It's just sort of expected that like, well, I work this way and you work this way, and we get along great, so that's fine. But you actually have to take the time to write it down and then take the time to discuss that with your employees and then with the people you're hiring, because that's when it doesn't get ingested as a team.
And I do think that once you cross the 30 to 50 person mark, like having a VP of people is like a must have, because I think that's around the size where like you start to lose the culture a bit more than like the earliest founding team members. And so it's starting to grow bigger and you're starting to get more attrition too. And so we have a portfolio company who has 180 people and doesn't have a VP of people, and we're freaking out trying to make that higher. So
yeah, one of the mistakes I see younger companies or younger founders making as well is decision by committee too. And that relates to many pieces of running a startup, but I think particularly as it relates to culture and people, this idea that, you know, I want to have a flat structure, I want to be open, I want to take input from everyone, I think can end up really dispersing culture or letting a majority of people lead versus the leader leading. I think as the leader, you have to take responsibility for defining and setting the culture. You can take input, but at the end of the day, you're the one who has to make the hard decisions. And so I'm seeing a little bit some trip ups there with younger founders who want to be super inclusive. And I think that can be a real thing to fall foul of.
And that, you know, ties into a couple of questions we got about, okay, everyone's coming to the founder to answer the question. That was fine when we were 5 people. It is less cool at 20, 30, 50 people. How do you divorce yourself from that? How do you spread things out without diminishing accountability?
You have to hire people who are smarter than you. I mean, that's the role of the CEO, right? Is to set a strategy and then hire people who can go and execute on that strategy. And I think that sometimes in a bid to fill open roles, people are hiring the wrong people for the role. So they're not hiring someone who knows more about that role than they do. And then that's where you have this issue of I can't let go and let this person have autonomy. And I can't thus empower them to answer questions on my behalf.
I think it's
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I think it's really hard for like founders to change that. Like there's a Series B company where in our portfolio where the 2 founders have always been like the decision makers, right? One is like a CTO, one is the CEO, and like it has become a significant bottleneck into like why they're not growing faster and like why products aren't being rolled out, and actually like things get lost. And then they made the switch last year to like this year where it's like decisions are made by business units. But even that is not like they're experiencing problems. So I feel like it's so specific to the company and the culture. They actually hired in like an organizational coach just to figure out like, particularly for them, how do you increase like communications and transparency across, they have teams across India, LATAM, and New York and Florida. So like everybody's sitting in different places and trying to consolidate that kind of culture and communication and decision making is like, it's a huge challenge. I don't think like you can ever solve it, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think solve it in a big company either. I remember being in a big company where, you know, people write all about Elon saying, I want to approve every hire or any CEO but many CEOs of large public companies have instituted that policy at some point. And I think, Robin, to your point, like What we're not really addressing is that it's a very hard journey to go from being founder to scaled CEO. And most founders don't grow up with that support. And I think that's where boards can be really helpful, to say you actually need that organizational design consultant, or you need an executive coach to help you understand how do you create different design or let go of decision-making responsibility. I think the other place it gets really complicated is when you have two co-founders who are co-CEOs. And I've seen this work in very, very rare circumstances, but that's also something that you have to let go of pretty quickly to have to find roles on decision-making.
So a number of people have hired in the last couple of years chiefs of staff, and that is a really amorphous role. It means lots of different things in different companies. When is it appropriate to hire a chief of staff for your startup? Would you look at that and start scratching your head if someone has that in a 10-person company, as opposed to, scratching your head as to why they don't in a 200-person company? No hard and fast rules, since it's a largely new-ish or newer role.
I'm the wrong person to ask because I have been a chief of staff.
You have one?
No, I have been one.
Oh, you've
So I have a very specific view. I think you don't need a chief of staff until you have a staff. If you're a startup founder and you have a chief of staff, it means.
So hold on. Does that also mean like you don't need a chief financial officer until you actually have financing?
No, well. All right. No. I mean, let me put this in context. There's a spectrum on the chief of staff scale. There is, I say this politely, glorified executive assistant, right? That has gotten that title at many large organizations. And then there is true 2IC. Like if you go to Bloomberg has a chief of staff who's can step in for Bloomberg, or step in for the CEO. And there's a spectrum up this end where you can act as true 2IC, which is depending on the needs. I've seen chiefs of staff operate as pseudo CFOs, pseudo COOs, right? It depends on the needs of the company. Then there's a next layer down, which is I'm helping the CEO kind of wrangle all the lieutenants of the company. And so these guys are like really useful in big organizations, 1,500 person organizations, et cetera. I think when I hear a startup say, or a startup founder say, I'm looking for this role, I'm actually really trying to understand, well, what is the gap you're trying to fill? Is the gap you're trying to fill that you're time for and you just need more people to help you do things? Or do you have a specific part of the business that is lagging? And often that's something to do with operations. And so people think that can be filled by a chief of staff. Plus you have some other projects that I'm not saying they can't be successful, but I think you really have to ask yourself, what is the need that I'm trying to solve for, except for the fact that I'm overextended? And then you have to say, is the person I'm hiring someone, a true chief of staff role is they're there to be your quarterback and they're there to make the CEO successful. It requires a lot of trust. You should be bringing them into your own personal tent. But if your problem is the operations in my company are sloppy, then maybe you should be hiring a VP of operations or a business operations person. And I think people have heard this and it kind of feels like a catch-all title. So they're like, I'm busy, I need something to solve for that. Let me hire for this person.
Yeah, I have, out of, I think, all of our US portfolio, there's probably, and that's maybe 200, all close to 200 portfolio companies. We probably have, because we have communities within all of our portfolio. So like we have all like the CFOs join a community in our portfolio, all the CTOs, CEOs, et cetera. And so like our chief of staff community is probably like 10 and out of all the portfolio. And so and they typically are like Series B and later.
That's really helpful level setting. So I'd love to get some questions from those of you who are here in the room or in the chat, and we have some people, particularly in the back, who are expert on culture and inclusive cultures. So I don't know if folks want to pose questions to Robin and Nisha, and also if you do have.
Ask Candace these questions, not us.
I mean, I didn't mention her by name, but I did look and point. But
Sorry.
Go ahead, bring it.
Okay.
And who are you?
Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Candace Morgan. I lead equity diversity at Ventures. And my question was back to the hybrid work. I know that's a really tricky one. I think that very few organizations will have to hybrid well. But I guess my question is, the going assumption is that hybrid work is less productive and more diffuse. And I feel like that was kind of the assumption in responses. But then you have these companies that are remote first, for example, GitLab, which is in our portfolio, et cetera. And the research is very fuzzy when it comes to hybrid work and productivity. I feel like the research usually cancels one another out. It basically shows that people who are productive at the office are also productive at home and vice versa. And employees are generally happier, feel more mental, space with the ability to work. So I guess my question is, has it just been the case in your respective portfolios that hybrid work has been less productive because it's not managed well? Or have you just never really seen a good example of hybrid work that's effective?
There's just, I think one of the biggest challenges that come up for hybrid work is how do people get to know each other as people, and then like things get escalated because you don't have that, water cooler talk, or just like instances where people could just grab lunch or grab a coffee, right? Like come across each other at the office. People become a lot more transactional with each other, and like it becomes like things escalate really, really fast, and like teams then get upset at each other. So I feel like that has become like a big cultural challenge, and I actually even see that like even within GTV, where like like other colleagues that I've like never met in person, like you just don't have as much empathy for each other than you would, I think, like in the office, even if you try to, right? And I think the other challenge is like different teams have different work cultures too, like working styles. And there's this one company in our portfolio who has about 200 people, and they like their big issue is that like they're trying to fix the culture and change it to one culture, but like some teams are like, oh, how come this team is working overtime and weekends, and like this other team is not doing much, and they're like not even responding to emails quick enough. And so I don't know like what the answer is, but I'm seeing some of these are like a lot of challenges that have been coming up because of, I think, more so from remote work than before.
I have a hypothesis that's probably a little too former ex-consultant, so I'll try and rein back from that. But as someone who's very interested in process and efficiency, I wonder if part of the issue is not that like all of a sudden we're less productive. It's that, in fact, we didn't really know how to be that productive to begin with. And that was covered up by the fact that we were all together. So when you're sitting next to someone, you sort of see how they work and you pick it up, and that was fine. But the honest truth is that at many organizations, particularly large organizations where there are a lot of layers, and even most people aren't good managers. And that's because they've never been taught to be good managers. And so I think there is probably a lot of responsibility on leadership. If you go back to your comment about organizational design, on like, how do we train managers well? Or at the very least, how do we set working norms? So, and this is where I don't want to get too ex-consultant, like you could go all the way off the deep end and create too many processes and handbooks, and people are like, getting out. But there is some sense of like people don't know how to run meetings. People don't know how to walk away with next steps. takeaways. People don't know how to get things done, right? And so what are the norms you can set, even in your own early stage startup, that can then make, we've actually been experimenting with this internally at our firm, which is, it's one thing to say, we're going to set culture and values. It's another to say, we're going to set operating principles that are like, here's how we work at BEG. And everyone is expected to sort of work in, to some degree, a similar fashion. So we all sort of know our marching orders. And again, I would say this is very much like a hypothesis, but also comes from some observations of being at a much larger company where I was continually surprised at how 6,000 people could be in the same building and still never get anything done. So, you know, I think it was always there.
So Ritu Gupta asked if we could repeat the question. So just to repeat Candace Morgan's question, it's about whether we've seen good examples of hybrid, whether hybrid works, because the studies go in both directions. And I want to just key in on one, and it's a great question, and I want to key in on just one component of your answer, Nisha, which is you talked about productivity. We see productivity as something easily measured. Value is different. And I don't know that I will ever forget 20 plus years ago, I was counsel to this bizarre startup that kept getting financing rounds and swapping out CEOs. And they had an amazing salesperson who was extraordinarily productive and extraordinarily destructive. And I would argue that the smartest thing for them to have done would have been to fire him before they got addicted to the heroin of his sales. Super productive, super corrosive. And so part of the time, and I know I think about my time with my colleagues differently today than I did 5 years ago, but part of it is whether you're productive when you're in person as opposed to are you receiving and adding value in person, and how we strike that balance. And I don't know that we figured it out. Candace, I don't know if you feel like you've got some shareable insight on how you figured that out in your role.
I think just to clarify, people generally feel a lift in mental well-being with the option to be able to work in a hybrid manner, which is positive. But to the point, new hires and onboarding suffer when you're in a environment, and most startups are terrible at onboarding. You went as far as management, which I don't disagree with. But you know, and so I think that there is a lift when it comes to employee well-being. However, there are these challenges that amplify environments. I don't think I answered your last question. That's a hard one, but I think that I just want to clarify that there is research that
There is a,
particularly in some of marginalized groups, to be able to.
yeah, and there's a diversity component to hybrid. I just want to repeat it quickly for the folks on Zoom, that there is a lift when people are working in hybrid, but it's hard to onboard if no one's around.
And actually, to the mental health point, for younger and newer hires, their mental health may be lower when they come in because they're not getting that connectivity or that training. And so it's the swing both ways, I think, is really challenging to manage.
So I saw Ritu also put a question in the chat, which is for pre-seed, seed stage, should we consider a 409A valuation for various purposes, including option repricing? And if people do have option repricing questions, because I get a lot of them, yes, do not reprice options without getting a 409A, and you should make sure that your 409A valuation firm does have the information they need. So if something major has happened at the company, they should have that information as part of it, or you don't have an argument that your reliance on that 409A valuation was reasonable, but you should not reprice options without a valuation. So, and we're happy to take a couple of other questions. Go ahead.
I'm Swede. Airbnb plus charge. So how do you define traction? Is it just revenue, recognition, or the team?
Depends on the stage of the company. I think right now there is a higher expectation for traction. But as Robin said, great companies are still getting funded at pre-seed where there is the right team. And so I think you have to figure out, depending on the stage, what is the story of traction that you can share. So even like take a pre-seed company, even if you haven't had funding, what is the research you've done, the focus groups you've done that show evidence of movement by your team that demonstrate with your first round of funding to be able to take that and run with it. So, I mean, I think this is a question every founder has, but it does really depend exactly on your, I mean, I can tell you, like I can pick any category and say like, in healthcare today, if you're a digital health company, the milestone on traction for Series A is maybe 2 to 5 times more than it was last year. But I think it's pretty industry specific.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat, and then I'll go back to one in the room. For people, this is from Sandy Yu, for people from underrepresented communities where no one they know or look like is in venture, if they're interested in exploring venture, what's your advice to get a foot in?
To a venture job.
I assume so, but to venture.
I think it's a remarkable time to try and find a job. I'm not going to pretend there are a lot of jobs available, but I would say you've never had more resources available publicly to try and learn about the job, which is really exciting. If you go on Twitter today, there are extraordinary accounts like Nicole from Harlem, who has 50,000 followers that she's built just by helping people how to figure out what the venture job entails. There are extraordinary notions that people have set up where these are all the different job lists in venture. They collate all the people who are hiring right now. The twins who are at Andreessen Horowitz have extraordinary newsletters. So there's a ton of like resources available. That's where you start. And if you're not availing yourself of those resources, you're starting on a back foot. The worst email you can get if you're in venture is an email that says, hey, I'm really interested in getting a job in VC. Can I pick your brain for 30 minutes? So start with the resources that are available and then try and figure out if you have an opinion on some part of the market, because having a conversation or a value exchange of ideas, I think, is what gets any investor really excited. And so if you're on the lookout to hire someone, you always want to hire the person who has some sort of developed point of view in an arena. And it's okay if you're not the world's greatest expert, but if you have demonstrated that you've written something about an arena, that you've been tweeting about that arena, that you've started to build your community or set a deal flow in that arena, you immediately sort of put yourself a little above those other folks in the market. And I would say really view analysts and associates as your potential best friends. I think a lot of people sort of overlook the junior folks in venture. That's where you can build your best networks, particularly if you haven't met anyone before.
I also think that like it really depends on what position you're looking for, like coming into like how many years of experience you have, like to like if you want to be on the investment side, right? Like you really have to understand what, like if you want to get into venture, like what is truly venture. Venture is like you have to like make money. And so you have to be a person who really wants to make money and make money for other people too, who are your LPs. And I think a lot of people coming into venture, and even when I like came into venture, stumbling into venture like you, right? I think like at GGV, there's like 4 of the 6 managing partners are on the Forbes Midas list. And like to get to that hurdle and like to return hundreds of millions of dollars, it's like not easy. And so I think a lot of people want to get into venture because it seems so fun on the surface, sexy, right? And like an associate analyst and even a VP or principal job is very different from like a partner level job.
Yeah, I mean, you're a money manager.
Yeah.
And most people interviewing for a VC job have not actually understood the economics of the VC fund, and so there's a big disconnect. But we just hired a new. So I think for the person who asked the question, we just hired a new VC associate, and her background is her family are immigrants from Latin America. She went to school in upstate New York. She never really thought about getting into venture. She ended up in a job in finance, but she kind of started doing all the stuff I described on her own, right? She built a meetup group for women in Brooklyn who are operators at tech companies. She went and availed herself of, a Latinx community accelerator for people interested in VC. And she was willing to take a step back to some degree or take a lateral step to join a firm so she could get into venture and learn the job. And I think those are the things that you see in common with folks who were previously not connected into that world. But she also understands the math of a venture firm.
And I think because you're talking a little bit about community and building community, and I want to just mention one of the founders in our program was talking today about having started Female Founders in Hospitality, which is a small but growing group. And if you are interested in connecting with her because you're in that cohort, she's in the back of the room today, and I'm sure would be happy to talk. But thinking about building community and what you can do to add value to the community, Nicole DeTomaso at Harlem Capital has done a great job and does share out, is someone that you should follow, does share out job openings in venture. Harlem Capital, I was at their annual meeting yesterday. And
also fully remote firm.
And yes, and they also provide great data, which is giving that value back into the community in addition to the inclusion work that they're doing. And maybe to end this thread, we'll go to Nadia and Ronnie in the chat. The remote hybrid conversation is so interesting. And she talks about the element of equity and that remote hybrid can support inclusivity of people who may not have been able to take a role on top of benefits for new parents or hiring talent across borders. And that's part of why we don't want to lose and want to include the people who are joining us remotely today. So we appreciate folks bearing with us on that. I want to also thank you, Nadia, for that comment. And I want to thank Nisha and Robin. A couple of closing thoughts. Thanks again to the Lowenstein Venture Crush team, Ariel, Brittany, Angela, Jenny, Karen, Owen, and Carrie Fisk, and also a save the date for Thursday, a week from today, June 29th, 5 p.m. right here in this room, 2 panel discussions for our Venture Crush Africa Global, which we're doing this time in partnership with Africa Tech New York. Sometimes we do it with Ingressive Capital or another firm, but we'll have conversations on founder fundraising and scaling challenges, and we'll also have an investor fundraising, meaning fundraising from LPs, which for Africa-focused funds right now, not a great time, but worth talking about for sure. And that is happening the day before the anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And so I also want to underscore Pride Month, and there's our HRC 100-point score for the 6th consecutive year for us at Lowenstein Sandler. We appreciate having all of you join us for these events. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to attend, if you've been attending on Zoom and you want to attend in person, feel free to let us know. And if there are other folks that we should be including, especially but not exclusively, if they make our events more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, you should let us know. We appreciate it. Thank you all. For the folks on Zoom, we're saying goodbye, and for the folks here in the room, you can just flip your badge and you will see your breakout room assignment, which happens in about half an hour. There's some time for networking and drinks, and then after that, we have a whole bunch of wine and food to lure you into having chats with one another. So hopefully you'll get to know each other. Thank you all so much.